Now you remember in this plot of assassination was both Secretary of State William Seward and Vice President Andrew Johnson. And Booth and Lewis Powell put this together that these would all happen at the same time. So we're not going from, like Lincoln's assassination attempt to the others. These are happening at the same time. Okay, now, Lewis Powell was assigned to kill Secretary of State William Seward, and David Harold was going to help him. But the main responsibility to assassinate Secretary of State William Seward was that of Lewis Powell. And he's going to take this David Harold with him. Again, it'd be kind of important to have this green sheet in front of you, because you got to go back to these names. Okay? I'm going to repeat it. So, while Lincoln is being assaulted at Ford's Theater at the same time, this is happening. But Lewis Powell is assigned to kill Secretary of State William Seward. And a fellow by the name of David Harold, who we gave you as co-conspirators, is going to be helping him. Well, the two men arrive at Secretary of State Seward's residence. Harold stays outside holding Powell's horse. Okay? So the two men, at the same time that Lincoln's being shot in Ford's Theater, the two men arrive at Secretary of State Seward's home. Harold stays outside the residence holding both horses. This is kind of an interesting story. Lewis Powell goes up to the door and knocks. Secretary of State Seward's servant answers the door. Lewis Powell insists that he is there to deliver medicine to Secretary of State Seward. So picture that in your mind. Lewis Powell knocks on the residence of Secretary of State Seward. His servant, Seward's servant, opens the door, and Powell tells the servant, "I am here to deliver medicine personally to Secretary of State Seward." Well, Seward's servant is a little uncomfortable with that because he does not know this guy. So he tells Powell, "Well, that's fine, give it to me. I'll take him the medicine myself." Okay? Well, after insisting a couple of times that, "No, I need to do it. I was sent here to do it personally," to the point where the servant isn't really buying that and saying, "No, I'll be happy to take it up to him," Powell simply pushes by the servant and heads upstairs on the staircase to where Secretary of Seward is resting. Okay? So, he tells this servant, "I need to take it up there personally." "No, I'll take it up there for you." He insists a little bit. Finally, Powell loses patience. He pushes by the servant, heads up the stairs to the secretary's room.
So Powell went up there, and who was the other guy? What was his name?
You got the guy helping him?
Yeah.
David Harold just stayed and held the horse. Yeah, he just stayed and held the horse. So this is Powell over. Well, once he gets up the stairs, who does Powell run into? But Seward's son, Frederick. We talked about him. He was serving as Secretary of State in his father's absence. So Powell gets to the top of the stairs, and who's he run into? Frederick Seward, because he's wondering, what's the deal here? What's going on? What's somebody coming up the stairs for? Well, Powell says, "I was sent here to give this medicine personally to Secretary of State Seward," in which his son Frederick says, "No, I'll go ahead and give it to him myself." He does the same thing as the servant. Okay? Because he didn't know this guy. Well, Powell then pulls his pistol, points it at Frederick in an attempt to kill him, but the gun misfires. These guys were bad at loading guns evidently at this time, but they're different. So Powell pulls out his pistol, aims it at Frederick Seward, plans on killing Seward, but the gun misfires. When the gun misfires, Powell then takes the gun and hits Frederick over the head with the butt of the pistol, actually fracturing his skull. Hit him that hard. So when the pistol misfired, Lewis Powell hit Frederick Seward over the head with the butt of the pistol or the handle of the pistol, and it fractures Frederick Seward's skull. Even gets crazier. Well, Seward's daughter, Fanny Seward, comes out of her father's bedroom wondering what's going on, sees these events between Powell and her brother, and screams as loud as she can. So Seward's daughter, Fanny Seward, steps out of her father's bedroom where she's caring to him, sees what's going on between Powell and her brother, and screams at the top of her lungs. Hearing the scream, Seward's personal bodyguard, George Robinson, comes onto the scene. Hearing Fanny scream, Secretary of State Seward's personal bodyguard, George Robinson, comes onto the scene. Powell overcomes him and bursts into Seward's room. So he disables the bodyguard as well and bursts into Powell bursts into Seward's room. Really determined? Yeah. Well, gun doesn't work. Doesn't have a gun to kill Seward with. So he grabs out a knife and stabs Seward several times. And he misses him for a couple reasons. One is
he's in a body cast.
he's in pretty much a body cast, so the damage is minimal in the body, but he also, because Seward is so skinny, he actually misses him several times in the bed because the guy is so skinny.
So he didn't even kill him.
No, we're not done yet.
Why are you laughing?
Well, finally, not that funny. He finally stabs Seward in the cheek and the neck and then slashes him with the knife. So he's not having much luck in the body area. As Miss McIntosh said, he was in pretty much a full body cast, but he also was so skinny he actually missed him several times. Got frustrated, went to the upper extremities and stabbed him in the cheek and the neck and then slashed him with the knife in his upper extremities as well. Seward would be disfigured for the remainder of his life because of these wounds. He will survive, but he will be disfigured. Well, this bodyguard, George Robinson, recovers because he knocked him out. He wakes up and tries to restrain Powell, but Powell makes his escape. And he thinks he's probably done enough damage to Seward to kill him, right? Probably thinks he did enough damage to kill him. Well, those witnesses to the scene at the Seward home that evening described the home as, quote, bathed in blood. Blood everywhere. Bathed in blood is what their description was of the Secretary's home that evening after Powell's efforts. But he will not kill Seward, but he will be disfigured for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, still one more, right? George Atzerodt, who's on your sheet, George Atzerodt had been given the task to kill the vice president. George Atzerodt had been given the responsibility of killing Vice President Andrew Johnson. That was going to be his job.
So who's George Robinson?
George Robinson was the bodyguard who he knocked out and then he recovered and still got away. Now, what was the plan is that Vice President Johnson was supposed to be at his residence at the Kirkwood House, which is a house that boarded people. So George Atzerodt had been assigned the task to kill Vice President Johnson, and he was going to kill him at his residence at the Kirkwood House. Now remember, all this is going on at the same time. Okay? Now this is kind of interesting because Atzerodt had actually rented a room in the Kirkwood House directly above the residence in which Vice President Johnson was staying. He earlier rented a room right above it. Now you got to remember that security was way different in those days. So it wasn't unusual. It was a boarding house. It was a rooming house. Vice President lived in probably a really nice room, but there were other rooms that were rented, and Atzerodt actually rented the room above it.
Was it just like someone's old house you need money, so they rented
Yeah,
the room?
only if this was a nice big room. Yeah, that's true though, yeah. Well, Atzerodt is all set up. He loses his nerve and just goes and gets drunk. That's what he did. Lost his nerve, didn't make the attempt on the vice president. Lost his nerve and decided to go get drunk instead, which he did.
Did he end up getting prosecuted? or-
We'll get to that. Oh, yeah, it's an interesting story. Well, that means we got to go back to Lincoln now, the death of a president. Tell you what's happening, because when we left the story, he was still hanging on there in the Peterson house. So we'll go to the death of a president. So what's happened is Lincoln's been shot and taken to the Peterson boarding house. At the same time, Seward's been assaulted by Lewis Powell. At the same time, Vice President Johnson was supposed to be killed, but Atzerodt loses his nerve and goes to a saloon and gets drunk up. Lincoln?
Yeah.
To the Peterson boarding house. Now, back at the Peterson house, the president is simply slowly dying. That's the best description I can give you. Been shot in the back of the head. He's going to have tremendous brain damage, and he's just slowly dying, is what he's doing. By the president's side is his wife Mary and their oldest son Robert. So at the president's side at the Peterson boarding house is his wife Mary and his oldest son Robert.
How many kids did he have?
Well, he had 3, but 1 died.
Oh, well,
Yeah. The younger son, Tad, T-A-D, they kept him at the White House. They didn't think he was old enough to see his father in such tough conditions, so Tad was not at his father's side. The decision was made by Mrs. Lincoln that Tad would stay at the White House because they didn't think he was old enough to see his father in such a tough condition.
How old was Ted?
Well, he was about 12 then,
I
wasn't he?
think he was 8. I'll have to
Was
look.
8? Oh, okay.
Remember, Willie was 11 when he died. I think, but I'll look that up before we go over. Now, more than 100 people visited President Lincoln during the night. More than 100 people, including Vice President Johnson, who had no idea at the time that somebody was out to kill him. So after Atzerodt chickened out, Vice President came from the Kirkwood House and went and visited the President during his condition. So more than 100 people visited President Lincoln during the night, which included Vice President Johnson.
How do you hold on so long?
Well, I don't know. I'm not a medical expert, but we'll see how long he hangs. So what time did he get shot about, do you think?
Wasn't it around 10 something?
10-ish, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, at 7 a.m. the next morning, Lincoln's breathing began to really slow down. At 7 a.m., his breathing began to really slow down. And at 7:22 a.m. on April 15th of 1865, 7:22 a.m. on April 15th of 1865, the 16th President of the United States died at the age of 56. At 7 a.m., Lincoln's breathing slowed. Then at 7:22 a.m. on April 15th, 1865, the 16th President of the United States died at the age of 56. One of the men at his bedside when he died was Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. One of the men, he'll come back, we'll be talking about him later in politics, but one of the men at Lincoln's side was a cabinet member. He was pronounced dead, and that cabinet member that was at his side was Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. When Dr. Leal pronounced Lincoln dead, at 7:22 a.m., Edwin Stanton said, quote, "Now he belongs to the ages." So again, at 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, died at the age of 56. Shortly after the President was pronounced dead, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton said, quote, "Now he belongs to the ages." What's that?
To the what?
He said, "Now he belongs to the ages." Is that what you asked? Okay. Well, we've got a dead president. We've got a severely injured Secretary of State. We've got a Vice President who's not been harmed. What's the next thing we're doing? Looking for John Wilkes Booth. The manhunt for John Wilkes Booth. Well, what did Booth do after shooting President Lincoln? I'm going to tell you. First of all, he crossed the Potomac River leaving Washington, D.C. He crossed the Potomac River leaving Washington, D.C. He then met up with David Harold. Who was David Harold again? Where did he just come from? He was at the Secretariat. He was holding the horses. He met up with David Harold, Booth did, just a few miles south of the Capitol building in the state of Maryland. If you go to D.C., you've got Virginia and Maryland, right close by. So after fleeing across the Potomac River and leaving Washington, D.C., John Wilkes Booth meets up with David Harold just a few miles south of our Capitol building in the state of Maryland. They went from there to a tavern in Virginia. Who owned it? Mary Surratt, where the group had met in the past. So those two guys met in Maryland and then went to that tavern in Virginia that was run by Mary Surratt. She actually leased it. She didn't own it, but it was her business. Now, as he left the tavern, Booth tells the bartender that he had killed Abraham Lincoln. So as he leaves the tavern that was leased by Mary Surratt, Booth tells the bartender at the tavern that he had killed President Lincoln. Well, back in Washington, D.C., Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who said now he belongs to the ages, ordered the manhunt of Booth. He ordered people to start hunting for him. And he offered a reward, big one, $100,000, which in today's money would be almost $1.5 million. So he offers a $100,000 reward for the capture of John Wilkes Booth, which would be about $1.5 million today.
Who offered it now?
Edwin Stanton, the
Okay.
Secretary of War.
Thank you.
It was $100,000, which had been about $1.5 million. Now this is kind of interesting. Stanton thought this assassination of the president was a Confederate conspiracy to try to save the Confederacy. And who did he think ordered it? No, good guess. Who do you think he thought ordered it? No. Who was the president of the Confederacy?
Oh. Davis.
Jefferson Davis.
Yeah.
So, Edwin Stanton is pretty convinced that this is a Confederate conspiracy led by Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president. And because he thinks it's a conspiracy, he wants to talk to Booth. and he's offering a $100,000 reward, which would be about 1.5 million today. Now, within hours, soldiers, law enforcement officials, and even angry mobs, everyone was looking at him. Some of them because they were mad that the president was killed, but obviously some of them because
They want money.
there was a lot of money on the line if you could find it. Now, we'll finish the day with this because I'm kind of fond of you. And we're going to see, ever watch the movie or the series Pawn Stars?
Yeah.
Okay, somebody came in with an original poster showing the $100,000 reward, an original, not many around, and we're going to see what it's worth. Okay? We're going to see what it's worth.